We did was, it started in '78, and most people at the time, I'd just come to America a few years earlier, most Americans said, well, it's better to be dead than red. And I said, you mean you'd rather be dead? Yes, we don't want to be communists. Not that they understood what that meant anyway. And I said, well, what about the pygmies in Africa? They'll die too. And they said, yeah, better they're dead too. They don't want to be communists either. So today, Russia's got 2,500 weapons. There are only 240 major cities in the Northern Hemisphere. The data for nuclear winter has just been redone by the meteorologists, and it's worse than originally predicted. 1,000 bombs on 100 cities would create nuclear winter and the end of life on Earth and plunge us back to stage. We're worried about global warming. This is the elephant in the sitting room that no one looks at. But you see, we can cut through that, being doctors, and say this is medically contraindicated. It's not being brave, it's just speaking our truth as we've learnt it as physicians.
I think I need to... As if I could stop you.
Dr. Helen Caldicott is the co-founder of Physicians for Social Responsibility, founder of the Women's Action for Nuclear Disarmament, and founder and president of the Nuclear Policy Research Institute. She has received many awards for her work, most recently the Lannan Foundation's 2003 Prize for Cultural Freedom, 19 honorary doctoral degrees, and was personally nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize by Linus Pauling, himself a Nobel laureate. It's live in the studios this morning, Dr. Helen Caldicott.
I'll tell you a funny story. I gave a talk the other day, and I talked a little bit about why men kill, and a man came up to me, he said, I've got prostate cancer, and he said, I was given my first dose of estrogen the other day. He said, for the first time in my life I felt like shopping. And that's a true story. And there is a tremendous difference neurophysiologically between the hormones, and I think it's time that the women had proportional representation, which is 53%. And you'll get people like Hillary, and you'll get all sorts of political stripes and colours, but the magic number is 30%, below which the women tend to vote to please the men, as we've been brought up to do. Above 30%, the women say, no, we're not voting for missiles today, we're voting for milk for children. And it's of all political stripes and colours. So, and France has passed a parity law that 50% of people running for political office have to be women. It's interesting, they're setting the tone. Well, they had their revolution before you, didn't they? That's why they gave you the Statue of Liberty.
So would that be part of your presidential platform? That
oh yeah, I'd really, yeah, I'd pass a decree, I guess, that 50% of all people running for office, and I would get rid of this dreadful, that I would use the model of Australia. Our elections are 3 weeks long from the announcement of the election, and there's virtually no money. Well, there's a bit of money involved in it now, but virtually no money. And if you get, I think I ran for Parliament once and nearly won. If you get above 3% or 4% of the vote, the federal government pays for your campaign.
We're speaking with Dr. Helen Caldicott. She is co-founder of Physicians for Social Responsibility, and you mentioned talking to people. You're actually going to be talking to people this evening. It is a fundraiser for Washington Physicians for Social Responsibility.
Leadership. Helen Caldicott.
Well, I do feel like a mother. I do feel like I've given birth to something really profound. It was always my feeling ever since I entered first year medical school, I guess, in 1956, that and I took the Hippocratic Oath, that doctors had a profound responsibility, not just towards our patients, but towards all of creation. I guess as I learned histology and biology, and that's why I'm a pantheist, that I worship nature, and that we in fact understand, I think, biology better than most people on the planet, because we deal with life and death many days, and with the human psyche. I always felt with PSR that we had the tools to save the planet. And in fact, and indeed, we did end the Cold War. And how it started was that we started, I was writing a paper for the New England Journal, asked by Arnold Relmond to write a paper about the medical implications of nuclear power. And I spent a year researching that subject. In fact, the paper was rejected because when it was peer-reviewed, they said, well, you didn't give the other side. And I said, but there is no other side medically. It's like saying, well, polio is bad, produces infantile paralysis, but on the other hand, it's got some good features. And I said there aren't any, so they rejected the paper. But as I was studying this subject, and I was on the faculty at Harvard working in the cystic fibrosis unit, and I had a super boss called Harvey Colton. Some of you might have known him. He's just died of colonic cancer. I can't imagine the world without Harvey. He was a wonderful, wonderful, brilliant man. And during that time, a young man came to see me. He was an intern at Cambridge City Hospital called Ira Helfand, and there was a referendum in Cambridge to stop all nuclear activities, which would have meant MIT closing down its reactor, Harvard stopping all nuclear activities and the like. And there was a strong push against that, and he said he needed some articles. And we were talking about this, and I gave him a few articles, and he said, I turned to him and I said, Ira, you know, this is a medical problem. Let's start a medical organisation. And he said, yeah, okay. And we had the first meeting in my sitting room or study. Well, so what we did, the first thing we did was put an ad in the New England Journal of Medicine about the medical implications of nuclear power, and it happened to come out serendipitously the day after 3 Mile Island melted down. Bang! We had 500 new members in a flash. We were working in a broom cupboard in Richard Feinbloom's general practice in Harvard Square, and we were deluged with people. And so we just took off with a flying start. And then we started to decide, we decided we'd do the first symposium at Harvard on the medical implications of nuclear war. And at the time, most of the old fellows from the Manhattan Project were still alive. Jerry Wiesner, who was Jack Kennedy's science advisor. Jerry said to me, he said, you know, one day I was standing in the Oval Office and Jack was standing there, as he did, with his hands behind his back, looking out the Oval Office windows, and the rain was falling. And it was the time of the testing, and the rain was full of strontium-90, and he said, you mean, Jerry, there's radiation in that rain? And he said, yes, Mr. President. And that brought about the Partial Test Ban Treaty. George Kistiakowsky, the chemist who formed the implosion mechanism for the first bomb with the plutonium, first bomb named Trinity after the Father, Son and Holy Ghost. And when Oppenheimer watched it explode, he said, I've become the death, the shatterer of worlds. And then he said, for the first time, physicists have known sin, and they have been sinning ever since. And I'm fed up with them. I'm fed up with these people who are sinning. And they know damn well that E equals mc squared, and to release the energy inside the atom is just catastrophic. And Oppenheimer knew when he watched Trinity explode that he'd captured the energy in the stars and we could destroy the planet. And by God, we're very close to doing it. And by God, no one cares. Except us, maybe, and a few others. Hardly any. Oh, well, Kissinger's got into it now, like, after a long time, and George Shultz after a long time, but they're slow in learning. But we've led the way. So we had our first symposium at Harvard, 2 days, and by God, the press were fascinated. And of course, the Boston Globe the next day had the concentric circles of destruction, and the bishops and the cardinals started reading about it, and they started to say, gee, Jesus wouldn't approve of this. And gradually, Hunthausen and Bernardine and all the others got together and they wrote the bishop's pastoral letter against nuclear war. And what we did, too, was spawn other groups. So we got architects for social responsibility, psychologists, real estate agents. I was asked to speak at the annual Morticians Conference about nuclear war, and I said, well, why do you want me to talk? And they said, well, we don't want to have to embalm radioactive bodies. And I said, don't worry, you'll be one yourself, you know. So they passed a resolution against nuclear war. And all the stratas of academia banded together. Architects said it was bad for architecture, bad for history, you know, archaeologists. And so we spawned, we sort of gave birth to all these other groups, and they just rose up. So in 1982, what happened? We got 1 million people in Central Park. I also had a wonderful publicist called Pat Kingsley, who heard me speak, I think in the LA PSR conference, and she said she'd work for me for free. And the way she did it was, I was a boring old woman, doctor, you know, in tweed suits, talking about the medical effects of nuclear war. Who wants to listen to that? But she got Sally Field and Candy Bergen and Lily Tomlin on, and she'd ring up the producer and say, I'll give you the film stars, but you've got to have Helen Caldicott. Well, they did, you know. So I'd come on, and Lily, for half an hour, she would have given all the effects, the medical effects and everything. There was nothing for me to talk about when I got on, because Lily learnt the whole thing. But because of Kingsley, I was in Vogue, Family Circle, Ladies' Home Journal, I mean everything. Merv Griffin, who's just died. Actually, the Merv Griffin was the first show I went on, and I was on with Ava Gabor. And she had a big pink dress on, very low, but a big pink frill around there, and diamonds like the size of pears hanging from her ears. And I only had a little time to talk, and I was talking about the medical stuff, and she said, the Russians roll over children with tanks. And everyone clapped, and then we had a break for an ad. And I was so nervous, I picked up a glass of water and put it straight down my front. And then I thought, children. So when it came back again, I said, yes, the children don't believe they're going to survive, like Natalie. And I got in just under the wire. You've got to be quick, you know, on television. And so Kingsley actually, through the media, mobilised 80% of Americans. We did it too, but it was through the media. And really, the media is determining the fate of the earth. I gave a 3-minute speech before this 1 million people, a sea, an ocean of faces in New York, and I dropped the bomb. I didn't know what to say when I got up there, and I thought, yeah, I'll drop the bomb on them. And I was leaving Central Park, and a woman came rushing up. She said, were you on television this morning? I was actually on with Orson Welles. It was amazing. He was so huge they had to lift him, he was in his wheelchair, lift him up with a crane onto the platform to speak. Anyway, she said, I was in the shower and I heard this voice saying, every town and city with a population of 50,000 or more is targeted with at least one bomb. She said, that's why I'm here. I didn't know that. You see, you just need one grab and people get it. So what we did was simply amazing, and we got to recruit 23,000 physicians, and by God were we powerful. And you're still powerful, but I used to travel around servicing, 123 chapters or something, and teach people how to speak on television and radio and, you know, become stars of stage, screen and radio. I believe that if PSR had continued the way it was going, by now we would have almost abolished nuclear weapons. We did bring an end to the arms race with the freeze in a certain sense. I went to see Reagan and we went to see Gorbachev, and it was spectacular, and the Berlin Wall came down, and I do lay that at our feet. We instigated that, and it came about. And for that I congratulate all of us. And that's practicing global preventive medicine through the political process. George I got rid of a few weapons unilaterally, and I've written about that in this book, The New Nuclear Danger, George Bush's Military-Industrial Complex. But then we got Clinton, who had no courage. He'd smoked some dope, but he didn't inhale, don't you know? He never went to Vietnam, so he felt embarrassed. He had no courage. And he left the weapons in place. Instead of saying, right, we handed him on a silver plate the mechanism to abolish nuclear weapons. And there was a precedent for that when Reagan and Gorbachev met in Reykjavik in 1987. They almost, over a weekend, abolished nuclear weapons, if you remember. It was absolutely a stunning exercise. And then Clinton came in, and instead of getting in Air Force One with a document flying to Boris Yeltsin, who was a hardened alcoholic, a bottle of vodka before breakfast, Wernicke's encephalopathy, Korsakoff syndrome, the whole deal, and saying, Boris, sign here, we're going to abolish nuclear weapons in 5 years, which he could easily have done. He left the weapons in place. And that is his legacy, and his wife is running now, and she has received more money from the military-industrial complex than any other candidate running, and I don't trust her. And just because she's good at raising money, doesn't mean to say she'll be a good president. And everyone gets on the bandwagon and follows. Obama came out the other day to abolish nuclear weapons. You know, no one's ever done that running for president before, and so is John Edwards. John Edwards? Yeah. He also is against nuclear power, incidentally. Obama takes money from Exelon, he's for it. Most people have no idea about the medical implications of nuclear power, none. Or the physics, or the chemistry, or the engineering, none. Especially the candidates. We've got to teach them. So the weapons stayed in place. So then we get this very low IQ president who is, I don't know if he's a sociopath, but he's a very strange character. There's a book written about him called Bush on the Couch by a psychiatrist called Frank, which is absolutely fascinating. He had a very traumatic childhood, suffice it to say, he's dyslexic, and, you know, I'm fascinated with analysing him, and I don't think anyone should get to be president or anyone in high office without being psychoanalysed. But then you'll have to psychoanalyse the psychoanalysts to make sure they don't have a political agenda themselves. But, you know, the real etiology of where we're at today is in the reptilian midbrain. And we use our left brain to rationalise what we really want to do in the reptilian midbrain. And there are some people who are well in control of their emotions, but many are not. And that's the dilemma of the human species. And unless we are prepared to look at the etiology of what's happening to our planet, we're doomed. So, as we just heard, there are 5,500 nuclear weapons on hair trigger alert here, and you've got most of them here in this beautiful state. And as I flew in yesterday, sitting next to a man working in Boeing, which is the second largest military contractor in the world, he is working on AWACS in Turkey. He's located in Turkey. What do AWACS do? Well, you know, the satellites, the geosynchronous satellites, target all the targets in Iraq and bomb wedding parties and, you know, the whole thing. That's called the militarisation of space. In fact, AWACS can look at the planes, they can look at the people on the ground and the tanks, and he's very excited about it. And I said, you know, what you're doing is not a... I didn't really take him on full frontal. I sort of left the poor fellow alone. But then we flew over Boeing. Miles and miles and miles of the bloody thing. And then there's Hanford, which will never be cleaned up. You can't clean up radioactive waste. You can transfer it from one place to another, but you can't clean it up. And in the process, you expose more and more people to the radioactive isotopes and carcinogenesis.
The federal government chose 560 square miles in southeastern Washington state on which to build nuclear weapons in the 1940s. This area, known as the Hanford Nuclear Reservation, produced plutonium for the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki. The need to bomb Nagasaki during the Second World War, and nuclear weapon production in general, remain controversial issues. The desire to clean up this ecological nightmare, however, remains common ground. The site rests along the Columbia River, which is the lifeblood of the Northwest. Citizens' tax dollars continue to pile up, to the tune of over $3 million a day, 365 days a year. Now, the major mission at Hanford is cleanup. Radioactive waste is stored in unlined soil trenches.
just speaking our truth as we've learnt it as physicians. So we got to within 10 seconds of the world blowing up in '95 when Yeltsin nearly pressed the button, when he thought that a Norwegian missile was an American missile, and America's still got a policy for first strike winnable nuclear war against Russia. And they never know when you're going to strike, and their satellites are all degraded and dilapidated, they don't work anymore. I honestly, when I collected the data for this, you know, you do with a patient all the tests and you examine them and do everything, and you work out a prognosis. I absolutely don't know how we're still here. The other issue that faces us is global warming, and I wrote about that in this book. Nuclear power is not the answer to global warming. I had a conference on this recently. Nuclear power produces global warming in its own right, in a major way. It's a socialised industry in a free market economy. You know, it's kind of communism. I thought Americans were against communism. And of course, it's incredibly dangerous. Most of the candidates don't know anything about that. So therefore, the nuclear industry has found that, you know, they're actually the answer to global warming, as Dick Cheney says. They emit nothing. They're emission-free, which is all a lie. And they're using Hill and Knowlton to propagandise the fact that they're clean, green and amazing. Hill and Knowlton did the tobacco industry advertising. This is a medical problem. This is a carcinogenic industry which will remain carcinogenic for 500,000 years, whose transient byproduct is the production of electricity for 20 years. As Albert Einstein said, nuclear power is a hell of a way to boil water. I love what Einstein says. So the answer to global warming, I've produced a wonderful roadmap. Here's an executive summary, but you can download it from IEER.org. The wonderful, brilliant man called Dr. Arjun Makhijani produced it, 270 pages. All electricity in America and all transportation can be produced by the year 2050 with no carbon emissions. None. And nuclear power, you remove the subsidies and it closes down, bang, like that, bang. So the answer to global warming is here. This is the prescription for survival for global warming. And it's the prescription for survival for nuclear power. And all we've got to do is have the courage to lead a revolution in America as we led a revolution in the 80s. That was the second American Revolution. To go from everyone supporting better dead than red to in 5 years 80% of Americans saying we want the arms race to end, we want a nuclear weapons freeze. And it was sagacious, Gandhian, peaceful, led by doctors. That's our role. The Earth is in the intensive care unit. It's acutely ill, and everybody on the planet is basically a physician to this dying planet. Whether we can save it or not, I don't know, as we don't know when total organ collapse develops in our patients and we lose it. We lose them. But sometimes when we stay up all night and we're totally committed to our patients, they survive. And that's how we were brought up. We get through that tiredness at 2 a.m. in the morning by having a milkshake and a hamburger, and we keep going and our brains lighten up again and we can think clearly for our patients. And that's where we're at now. There is no more important time in the history of human beings on the planet than now, in 3 million years. And I do believe that it's us, physicians, who have the golden key to making sure life continues on the planet. And I don't just mean us, I mean 30 million other species. We're the curators of life on Earth, but we know how to get into people's psyches and break through their psychic numbing. We do it every day with our patients. That's what we've got to do with society and with all the politicians who all need doctors at some point in their lives. And it's basically about love. PSR, when we started, was about love. There was so much love in National PSR and with all of us. That's what we've got. That's what we're about. Our love and dedication to our patients. That's what motivates us. That's why we got into medicine. So do it. Lead the revolution. I'll be there to help you. Thank you. Here's the solution to global warming. We have it within our capacity to mobilise this community, as we once did in the 80s, to produce abolition of nuclear weapons with Russia. And we have it within our ability to close down all reactors. That's in the roadmap. Remove the federal funding. Now, you must be informed. As your wonderful Jefferson said, an informed democracy will behave in a responsible fashion. So I invite you to read my book, Nuclear Power's Not the Answer. You'll have so many arguments. You'll be able to clean Dick Cheney's clock every time he tries to tell you it's good. Nuclear, and then the other one is The New Nuclear Danger, George Bush's Military-Industrial Complex, in which there's a chapter on DU weapons and the new weapons that America's building, and the neocons and the like, and War in Heaven, about the impending weaponization of space, partly led by your people here at Boeing. And if you all rise up, each one of you can be more powerful than the most powerful person who ever lived. I came here in 78, a mere woman, an alien, a young doctor, naive. And it was my naivety that's led me, because I don't see any problems in doing what I do or speaking the truth. And people like that. If you speak your truth, not worried about admonitions from others, you become a leader. Do it. Speak your truth and get out there.
A Nobel laureate. It's live in the studios this morning, Dr. Helen Caldicott.
I'll tell you a funny story. I gave a talk the other day, and I talked a little bit about why men kill, and a man came up to me, he said, I've got prostate cancer, and he said, I was given my first dose of estrogen the other day. He said, for the first time in my life, I felt like shopping. And that's a true story. And, you know, there is a tremendous difference neurophysiologically between the hormones. And I think it's time that the women had proportional representation, which is 53%. And you know, you'll get people like Hillary, and you'll get all sorts of political stripes and colours, but the magic number is 30%, below which the women tend to vote to please the men, as we've been brought up to do. Above 30%, the women say, no, we're not voting for missiles today, we're voting for milk for children. And it's of all political stripes and colours. So, and France has passed a parity law that 50% of people running for political office have to be women. It's interesting, they're setting the tone. Well, they had their revolution before you, didn't they? That's why they gave you the Statue of Liberty.
So would that be part of your presidential platform? That
oh, yeah, I'd really...
Yeah,
I'd pass a decree, I guess, that 50% of all people running for office. And I would get rid of this dreadful... that I would use the model of Australia. Our elections are 3 weeks long from the announcement of the election, and there's virtually no money. Well, there's a bit of money involved in it now, but virtually no money. And if you get, I think I ran for Parliament once and nearly... I mean, this is the elephant in the sitting room that no one looks at. But you see, we can cut through that, being doctors, and say this is medically contraindicated. It's not being brave, it's just speaking our truth as we've learnt it as physicians.
I think I need to... As if I could stop you.
Dr. Helen Caldicott is the co-founder of Physicians for Social Responsibility, founder of the Women's Action for Nuclear Disarmament, and founder and president of the Nuclear Policy Research Institute. She has received many awards for her work, most recently the Lannan Foundation's 2003 Prize for Cultural Freedom, 19 honorary doctoral degrees, and was personally nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize by Linus Pauling himself.
If you get above 3% or 4% of the vote, the federal government pays for your campaign.
We're speaking with Dr. Helen Caldicott. She is co-founder of Physicians for Social Responsibility, and you mentioned talking to people. You're actually going to be talking to people this evening. It is a fundraiser for Washington Physicians for Social Responsibility.
Leadership. Helen Caldicott.
Well, I do feel like a mother. I do feel like I've given birth to something really profound. It was always my feeling ever since I entered first year medical school, I guess, in 1956, that doctors, and I took the Hippocratic Oath, that doctors had a profound responsibility. What we did was, it started in '78, and most people at the time, I'd just come to America a few years earlier, most Americans said, well, it's better to be dead than red. And I said, you mean you'd rather be dead? Yes, we don't want to be communists. Not that they understood what that meant anyway. And I said, well, what about the pygmies in Africa? They'll die too. And they said, yeah, better they're dead too. They don't want to be communists either. So today, Russia's got 2,500 weapons. There are only 240 major cities in the Northern Hemisphere. The data for nuclear winter has just been redone by the meteorologists, and it's worse than originally predicted. 1,000 bombs on 100 cities would create nuclear winter and the end of life on Earth and plunge us back to the stage. We're worried about global warming.